welcome. Everyone, welcome to Scholar Sunday. So every Sunday we get to sit down with a really cool, super cool expert I find interesting and basically nerd out for a few hours. And I'm Aristocracy, spelt with an E, right, not an A. And if you guys have any questions for Dr. Miano, please put them in the chat. First of all, I want to introduce you, Dr. David Miano. Did I pronounce it correctly? Or am I
That's
wrong?
just like piano with an M.
Miano. Okay, cool. And you are an ancient historian and also a YouTuber, right? So would you like to kind of introduce yourself?
Yeah, I do basically everything ancient. So if it's from the rise of civilization all the way till the fall of the Roman Empire, around that time, anything pre-medieval, that's me. I do it. Although I did specialize more in college, I've kind of branched out since then. And you can hear all about ancient history from all around the world on my YouTube channel, World of Antiquity. And I do travel videos, traveling to ancient sites. I do videos where I debunk false notions about ancient history. I help students write about history, all kinds of stuff. So if you like that kind of stuff, head on over there and subscribe for me.
That's what I actually thought was so unique about your YouTube channel. There's plenty of people who do history videos on YouTube, but you actually, a lot of yours is just literally going to these historical sites yourself, which is very challenging because most YouTubers don't ever leave their house. Like I never do. So yeah, it's super cool. Especially the South America videos I saw were really, really cool.
Oh yeah, I did a whole series on the Maya in the Yucatan. It was a lot of fun.
So do you want to tell us a little about your PhD and just the research that went behind it and all that?
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting story because I had originally thought I was going to get in and out of school real quick. I was going to get a certificate so I could teach social studies for high school. That's what I was going to do. And so I went into college, and I'm going to wham bang, it's going to be done. And but the more I was there and going to classes myself that I had to take, I'm like, man, I want to do this. I really love this. I want to be a college teacher. And so I ended up staying longer and longer, right? And I was doing pretty much any general history, that kind of, because I was going to do social studies. But I found that the older it was, the more interesting it was to me. I just loved ancient times because we knew less about it, right? There was no room for speculation, and you didn't know really everything that happened. There weren't a lot of documents to study and so forth, and I just found myself drawn to that, and so that's what I began to specialize in. And then I wanted to go get my PhD because you can't teach on the university level without a PhD. So so then I started looking for schools for that. And I found I ended up going to UC San Diego, because it looked like they had a great program, and because I wanted to, of all the ancient histories, I wanted to study the ancient Near East. That was the one that excited me the most. And
what attracted you to the Near East?
I guess because that's kind of the cradle of civilization. It's kind of where everything started. And it ties in with the Bible. It ties in with the Sumerians and the first cities that arose and all that stuff. It just was really interesting to me. So I applied. I got in, and when I got there, they said, well, actually, we don't really do a PhD program in the ancient Near East.
Oh no,
it's in the brochure. Yeah, we're aware of that. But how would you like to do ancient Israel? Because that's what we really do well, And you like the Bible stuff, so how about we do that? And I was already there. So I was like, okay, all right.
That's actually perfect because we talk about Israel. I study Israel-Palestine, but more modern history. And people always ask me questions about ancient Israel as if I know anything. I'm like, dude, that is a whole other thing.
Oh,
so I'm super interested to get into that stuff. My viewers will absolutely love that.
Yeah. So I said, okay. And that's what I did. Now I did was able to minor in ancient Near Eastern studies, and then since I got my PhD, been able to branch out. Now I like to do world history in ancient times because I like to see the connections, right? I want to know like what was going on over here when this was happening over here, right? I want to know
Mm.
all, and so that's why and so in my teaching, I've also branched out, and when it just happens to be that when you teach it, you also learn it, right? So
Hmm.
I've learned a lot by actually doing courses on various countries around the world. So I've done courses um, on Egypt, and of course, well, I guess that's considered ancient Near East, but I've also done things on ancient India, ancient China, all that stuff. So
That is
it's
so
all
cool.
interesting for me. I love it. Yeah.
What a, how would you describe the near, like what the Near East is? Because that's usually a term that, colloquially right now people don't use a lot.
Yeah, it's the same as the Middle East. It's kind of weird when we speak about modern times and things going on today. We say Middle East, but for some reason, when we talk about ancient times, we say the Near East, and we mean exactly the same thing. I
Oh,
think,
that's interesting.
yeah, I think eventually we'll probably switch to just saying Western Asia, um, and I'm kind of trying to lean towards that myself. Just call it Western Asia, um, and because then it's easier to define instead of because when people say the Middle East, even there's still some debate about what that includes. Does it include North Africa? Well, technically, that's not the Near East or the Middle East,
Yeah.
but yet when people think of the Middle East, they do think of like
Hmm.
those Libya. They think of Middle East, but so it's kind of a tricky term. Yeah.
That's yeah. It is because people like on Calliopean Club, the Discord server we're in, we have all the continents, but then I also add the Middle East because it's such a distinct area to mention. But yeah, it's interesting that we call it the Near East, like in an ancient sense. That's really cool. Um,
Yeah.
so like, what unique challenges what was so did you end up enjoying like ancient Israel history? I don't know, is that the term that would be used?
Yeah, history of ancient Israel and Judah. Yeah. No, I enjoyed it very much. It was an intensive program. I had to learn to read, not speak, 8 languages to get my degree. So you end up not being really great, at all of them because you're just trying to get by. And since then, of course, you forget things. But I did have to learn 8, and most of them were dead languages that nobody speaks anymore.
Yeah.
But you got to be able to, if you want to read inscriptions or anything like that, you got to know some of the stuff. It was cool though. It is great because when you go into a class, right, and you're like, okay, we're gonna read the Epic of Gilgamesh now in the original language. That's fun, you
I,
know.
I kind of want to get into biblical history stuff in a second. First, I just want to thank. I just got rated by Denims, the streamer. So thank you. If you guys are just tuning in, be sure to just click, and one of my mods could just put in the my actual Twitch there, so you guys can actually join the conversation, ask your own questions. But yeah, Denims, thank you so much for that raid. Okay, so when it comes to Bible stuff, right? How challenging is it to study a piece of history that has so much baggage? Like, I don't know if baggage is the right word, right? But like, I guess baggage is the only one that I think of using.
I kind of know what you mean.
Yeah, like
Well,
yeah. So tell me about those challenges.
it's not all that much when you're studying it. It's when you're
Mm-hmm.
teaching it that um, you get some of that, right? Because your students come from all different backgrounds, right? And so they're used to viewing it from a certain lens, and you're trying to say, well, this is, we're going to look at it through the historical lens now instead of the religion lens or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's a matter, of kind of getting them out of their habits, so they could look at it the way that an academic might look at it, um, because if you're gonna use the Bible as a historical document, right, you're gonna use it the way you use all your historical documents,
Mm-hmm.
and so you kind of train people to do that. But sometimes I'll have to issue a caveat or something during the class to let them know, like, What I'm going to say is not, not intentionally trying to, attack your own faith or something like that. We're
Yeah.
just we're just looking at it from a certain point of view, from the academic point of view. I'm going to teach you how archaeologists and historians approach the material, so you can kind of understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I it's interesting. How would you describe what, for those who don't know, like what a lens is in history?
Oh, I mean, it just I just use that kind of to talk about your perspective, right?
Mm,
The way you're looking at it. When you read anything, like let's just say the Bible, you could read it in a certain way. Like, I'm going to read this book to see what I can get out of it to improve my life and make it better, or something like that. You could read it from that perspective.
yeah.
Um, but if you're reading it from a historical perspective, you're reading it as, like, okay, this is a product of its time. What were the people doing at the time that they were writing this? Well, what message were they trying to get across at the time? You know what I'm
Mm,
saying? Like, sometimes I'll discuss like the Ten Commandments or something like that, and we might read one of the Ten Commandments and say, well, how can I put this into practice in my life, right? But as a historian, you might say, well, when they made this law, at the time, how were they thinking they would put it into practice? You know?
yeah, that's
So
a really good way to put it.
yeah.
So, like, when I think what everyone's kind of wondering, and I don't, you probably get this question all the time, but how much can we prove? Like, how much of it is this is true from a historian's lens, right? Like even something from Jesus to the Jews being slaved in, sorry, Israelites being slaves in Egypt.
Yeah. I do a whole spiel on this just in general for history, but historians cannot tell you the truth. Okay? We weren't there. Nobody was there. Okay. So unless we get into a TARDIS and travel back in time and go there and look, we'll never really know for sure. So if a history teacher ever tells you this is a fact, they're not doing their job right, because you can't do that. You can't say this is a fact, and you can only speak in probabilities. You can only say this is more likely to be the case and this is less likely, because we have more evidence for this and we have less
Hmm.
evidence for that, right? This is more likely to have happened than that, and so forth. So with a lot of things that the Bible says happened, there might be no evidence for it whatsoever. It doesn't mean it didn't happen,
Mm.
but you just say, we don't know. We don't have enough information, you know. But there are some things you could say, oh, we have some information here. Yeah, that actually did happen, or at least the main event happened. Whether the particulars happened, you might not be able to tell, but you know that this, you know that, for example, that the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in the year 70. We know that happened. Okay, we have it in Roman records too, and so forth,
Mm.
right? Um, so certain events you can say, yeah, they happened, and when the Bible says they happened, they really happened. But other things you can never. Some things you might eventually find information, and other things it's too personal. You never know. Like two people having a conversation, how would you even know that they had that
Yeah.
conversation? There's no way, right? Yeah,
Yeah, unless there's happens to be like a, a really famous court case or something associated with
right.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, that's really interesting. So what evidence do we have for Jesus? Because the stuff that I've read seems to never be focused very much on Jesus himself, but that there was regularly, I guess, Jewish. Jewish people claiming to be prophets or were seen as prophets, and they were regularly crucified by the Romans. Like this was like a trend at the time.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, fortunately, I did a minor in early Christianity, so this
oh, cool.
is yeah. So yeah. I think there's a lot of today you'll find a lot of even on YouTube, plenty of channels, or even some authors who are writing about how Jesus never existed, right?
Hmm.
Well, the consensus in historical circles is that yeah, Jesus probably existed, because there's enough there to be able to say there was a Jesus of Nazareth. Now, of course, the details you can't establish beyond a doubt, but there are not that many scholars. There are a couple. maybe more than a couple. There are maybe 3 or 4, maybe, I don't know, who have written about it and have come up with the thesis that Jesus never existed. Or I shouldn't say that. Like, there's Richard Carrier, for example, is a prominent example. I think he
Hmm.
said there's um, a 1 in 3 chance or something that Jesus existed, according to and that's more skeptical than most. Um, but his thesis about how the Jesus figure came about, to me, seems even more far-fetched. So, yeah, there is enough. There are Roman sources that mention Jesus, and of course, there are Christian sources that mention him early enough that it would suggest that there was an actual Jesus of Nazareth. Um, Now, over time, many things are written about Jesus, and they get more and more embellished, and so forth, and so forth, and so on. So the further away you get from Jesus, the more, you know, once you get into the Dan
Yeah.
Brown stuff, it starts to be a little bit iffy. Um, but but yeah, so I would say, yeah, they're probably we have enough evidence that to suggest that there probably was a Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah.
That is actually really cool. Um, the what about I don't know, like what about Jews being slaves in Egypt? We just had Passover, so I'm thinking about
Yeah.
that.
There's absolutely no evidence
What?
whatsoever outside of the Bible that is the case. Now, it doesn't mean it wasn't the case. This is just another one of those situations. We haven't been able to find any corroboration, right, for what is said in the Bible. But it doesn't mean it isn't true, right? It's just that
Hmm.
we don't have anything from Egypt. Like, and people have searched, is there anything in Egypt that we could look at and say, oh, look, it's mentioning the Israelite slaves, Um, haven't found anything. Haven't found anything. Um, Again, very possible. But when we speak of probabilities right now, historians say, well, there's not enough evidence to say that this is probable.
Well,
Um,
we know the ancient historian, like the ancient Egyptians, they did practice slavery, right?
yes, they did. Most ancient societies did. Um, but we're talking about enslaving an entire like ethnic group, something like
Hmm.
that, which is kind of unusual. I mean, it could very well be the case, but it's just like for example, this we definitely think is not true, and this is not in the Bible, but this is a sort of a fable that has come out of it, and that is the ancient Israelite slaves built the pyramids.
Yeah.
You know, but the pyramids were already built long before
Hmm.
that would ever happen. And the Bible doesn't say that the Israelites built the pyramids. So you hear that. We also know that the ancient Egyptians were subject to a labor tax, which means the regular, everyday, not enslaved ancient Egyptians had to work for the government on their building projects. So a lot of the buildings that were made in Egypt were not made by slaves. They were made by the actual citizens of Egypt who had to work at certain parts of the year in order to construct things. So we know that.
That's so
Um,
interesting. A labor tax.
yeah, it's called corvée. It's a French term, but it's a kind of tax that existed in some ancient societies where um, instead of paying money, or in those days they didn't have money, they just had goods. Instead of giving goods or something like that, you would go and work. Okay, this month out of the year, you would go and work and on the Pharaoh's project or whatever, and then
Yeah.
you go work for a month, and then you come home. So that happened, and that's how a lot of the buildings got built.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because especially when you consider how challenging it was to build at that time, like we always wonder when we see them, like how that was possible. Why did the labor tax kind of fall out of favor?
Um, well, I mean, throughout the ancient period, it'll be common. I'm not sure, like as far as with Egypt is concerned, when they stopped doing it. I guess it would be by the time foreign nations began ruling them. So you have like the Persians come and rule, and the Greeks come and rule, and the Romans come and rule. It'd be a little bit different. They'd be under their own systems. Um, every country's different, Like in ancient Greece, I don't think there was any corvée that I recall, and but it might just be for a period of time. Like in this particular administration or during the time of this empire, whatever, they might have it, but then they might not do it afterwards, and they might bring it back, you know. So I don't know when the last time it was done. There might even be countries today that still do it, for all I know.
Yeah, it's funny because Marx always talked about the labor theory of value, and you could totally make it sound like that's what he means. Obviously, very different.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
they did it in Mesopotamia too, you know. Now they would always connect it with religions to make it like it not only an obligation to the state, but also an obligation to the gods, right? First of all,
that's much better form of propaganda.
yeah, and people were like, "Oh yeah, well we have to do it then. It's a form of worship." But a lot of times the buildings would be dedicated to gods. We're doing this for the gods. This is part of, you know, the worship of the god. And in Mesopotamia, they even went so far as to say that the gods explicitly dictated it. Well, actually, they did it in Egypt too, because the pharaoh's a god and he can tell you whatever he wants you to do. You know, it's part of your worship of the pharaoh because he's a god to do his work. But in Mesopotamia too, the kings would say, well, the gods have ordered this to be done. And in fact, in their mythology, they say that humans were created for the very purpose of being slaves to the gods. So that's why we're here.
It's convenient.
Yeah.
What are some of like the most annoying misconceptions that people have about ancient history?
Well, one of the things that I tackle a lot on my channel is the not just ancient aliens. I mean, everybody knows about that, but there's sort of a watered down or more mainstream version of ancient aliens, where it's just a belief in ancient lost high technology, where it's there was great civilizations in the past before the last ice age that were destroyed, and this is like before 10,000 years ago, you know.
Yeah.
And they are looking for evidence for the existence of this, you know, highly advanced. And when I say highly advanced, they're very vague about this, but they usually mean having technology that rivals our own today, you know. And then they'll find things to try to show that it once, and they usually go to existing ancient civilizations. They love going to Egypt to do this. They do it in South America and Mesoamerica as well. They do it almost everywhere. They do it in India, where they're like, they'll take something that's believed to be from ancient times, but later ancient times, like in the normal sphere of ancient history, and they say, actually, the historians are wrong. This is not just 2,000 years old. This is 12,000 years old, you know, and they're lying to you. They put a bit of conspiracy theory into it too, because they're like, the historians, they're being paid off, to tell you lies about history so they can hide the existence of this lost ancient civilization. And like, why? I don't know why that would even be a motive, but that's what they say. And they're hiding the truth from you and so forth. Or they might just say they're dumb and they don't know,
Yeah.
But we independent researchers, we know, and so forth. But they sometimes call this lost advanced civilization Atlantis.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Atlantis.
Yeah.
You predicted it right.
Yeah, and they'll talk about the Atlanteans or something like that. But some go so far as to say aliens. Others say, well, we don't want to identify it. We don't really know the name of it, but it existed, And they look for connections. The one thing about it is they usually say it was a world-spanning civilization, right? So they'll look at places around the world that have similar artifacts, and they'll say,
oh no,
they're connected. Look, there's a pyramid in Egypt, and there's a pyramid in Mesoamerica. They knew each other, stuff like that, Look at this artifact over here. It has this symbol on it. And this artifact from over here has the same symbol, or really close. They must have known each other, and it must go back to the same time period, stuff like that.
What explains those similarities? Because I was actually just wondering that. Because especially, I've been starting to get into a lot of just South American ancient history and just history in general there. And it is kind of crazy, how similar that is when, they're so far apart.
Yeah, the similarities end up being rather superficial. Let's just say the idea of a step pyramid, okay? Because we're not talking about a real pyramid, like an actual real pyramid, like Egypt has smooth sides. You don't find that all over the world. you find step pyramids. Okay. And the thing
Interesting.
about the step pyramid is it's the easiest kind of building to make, right? You don't want your building falling over, right? So you're going to make it bigger on the bottom and smaller on the top, and then you can build it
That's so
higher,
true.
right? It's just, and I always use this illustration. You give a kid a bunch of blocks, and in a certain amount of time, they're going to end up making a pyramid. It's just the way to keep the blocks high, right? You just build it bigger on the bottom and smaller on the top. It's just, and if you look at the actual designs of the step pyramids, they're not the same. The only really similarity is that they have steps going up to the top, but that's just normal. I mean, would you ever say, oh, look they have stairs over here and they also have stairs over there? Amazing. No, because you can understand how stairs could be thought of independently, right? A person could, without knowing the other person, invent stairs here, and it also be invented independently over here. It's just something that comes natural. You know what I'm saying? A lot of the similarities are those types of things, or the symbols. If you have similar symbols, they're either not that similar, or they're like, that's a very simple symbol. You need something more to suggest that they knew each other, right? It has to be a set of characteristics that are similar. Then you might have something, right? If they have this and this and this and this, then you can name 12 things. They all have similarities. Then you're like, this could amount to something here, And even though they're thousands of miles apart, we don't know how they ever would have met each other. Maybe there's something to it. But there has never been, that I've seen, any kind of assemblage of evidence like that where you would say, oh, that's definitely more than coincidence, But they find one thing or two things, and they're like, ooh, coincidence? I think not. But it probably is coincidence. Yeah.
Is that why the ancient Egyptian pyramids are so famous? Because they're, they're mostly classic pyramids with like the smooth edge?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they would still be famous because of their size, but it was super impressive to be able to make a smooth-sided pyramid. I mean, that's pretty great. They can make a smooth pyramid. It took them a while to get it right. They started with step pyramids. The step pyramid of Djoser, for example, in the third dynasty was just a step pyramid. We think that's the first one. And then once you get to the fourth dynasty, this is like 100, 200 years later, they finally figured out how to do the smooth-sided pyramid. So it took them some time, but they figured it out, and it's really impressive. And, the Great Pyramid of Giza is the biggest one ever made. It's like 480 feet tall or something like that. That's pretty impressive. And it also has stood, right? I mean, the outside of it's gone, but it's still there. And it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's the only one left. So people even went to visit it in ancient times. Because like the Great Pyramid of Giza is like from like 2500 BC. So this is like, even like in 1000 BC, it would still be a place that you would go visit, because like it'd be 1500 years old at that time. So yeah, even in ancient times, people would go and go, ooh, wow, amazing,
So I noticed that medieval historians, they have this concept called medievalism, right? I'm sure you've heard of it. Is there, and just for my audience, like it's basically like our current cultural depiction of how we remember the medieval period and put into practice, right?
Yeah.
So like Game of Thrones, yeah.
King and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so is there a kind of version for that for ancient history?
I guess so. It might be to specific cultures, right? Because when we talk about medieval history, we usually mean Europe, and there's a certain cultural similarity there. With ancient times throughout the world is going to be different depending where you are. But like, let's say ancient Egypt, right? There's definitely like the popular mind what ancient Egypt is like, and it isn't exactly like. I'll just give you an example. I was just thinking this the other day. Whenever you watch an Egypt documentary, you'll often hear music that's supposed to sound like ancient Egypt music. Yeah. We don't know.
I know exactly what you mean.
But there's this kind of style of music of ancient Egypt, and we're like, oh yeah, but we haven't been able to reproduce their music. We have no idea what their music sounded like. But that's just kind of come with it now,
I never thought
Um,
about that. Like that, especially before the period of, I don't know the right term for this, but when Europeans started writing down music and everything, I know there's a lot of research going into African music as well, writing down. But so I guess did the ancient Egyptians not have any way to write down music?
well, we haven't found any. We haven't found any musical notation whatsoever. We have found images that seem to suggest um, conducting of some kind. Like there's an image of someone with like something like a flute, okay, and they're playing it, and then there's a guy. They're kneel. They're both cross-legged, sitting, and the one guy's in front of the guy playing, and he's like going like this, with his hands. And like, what's he doing? So we think maybe he's conducting or directing how to play the music. So maybe they had like a musical notation system with gestures, like a sign language of some
Mm,
kind. That's possible, but they didn't write it down as far as we can tell.
that's super interesting. Um, So I've also noticed in most universities, well, the ones that I know, there will usually be a history department, and then there might also be a classics department, right? So like, what is the difference, especially when someone sees like an HI history course on ancient Rome versus like a classics course on ancient Rome?
A lot of it depends on geography. It's the East Coast that you will find most classics departments, but on the West Coast, not so much. It
Oh,
kind of
really?
depends on the college. Yeah. Now it's traditional, and that's why on the East Coast you see it, to have a classics department, which usually means Greece and Rome, and
Mm,
sometimes it will include other stuff, but it's mainly Greece and Rome that you're talking about. And on the West Coast, they usually fold it into the history department. But there's a movement today among ancient historians, even among classicists, as they're called, to kind of just get rid of the classics designation altogether and not to call it that anymore, and just talk
really?
about, yeah, it's the history, or you could put it into archaeology or into history, but just to do it like, by geographical location, because there is a certain European um, bias to
Mm,
classics. In other words, that's like that. Like when you say classics, okay, you're talking about European history. The Greeks, the Romans, they were the greats, okay, and you don't have in there like any of the other ancient histories, okay. You know, uh, isn't it classic in ancient India or China or the America or anything like that, right? You want to you want to kind of like break that up a little bit and maybe just say, well, we're just talking about ancient history, the history of the Greeks, the history of the Romans, and then you can do the history of any other culture, and it's all the same. Instead of having that bias, like that somehow classics is special because the Europeans are special, you know.
mm. I noticed in general, like when I would take, especially my undergrad, I majored in history. So when I would take a classics course on, say, something like ancient Rome, it would be very focused on remembering facts, or like just I don't know, the way I was marked was very focused on remembering facts. So it was a lot of memorization, whereas history was actually very, and people always think like the history courses are this, but it was the opposite for me. It was very focused on argumentation and writing papers.
Ah,
Is
um,
that normal?
that may be true. I mean, I can't compare because I did it through the history department,
Mm,
so I don't really know. But I think a lot of it depends on the teacher, right?
mm,
How they were taught, and then they kind of do it the same way or whatever, right? So, but we are moving away from just memorizing things because what do you really learn that way? I mean, you learn, okay, this happened on this date and all that, but you forget that stuff.
mm,
Uh, you want to understand a little bit more about trends in history and why things happen. That's a little bit more important, right? Even in my classes, I never have anyone memorize a date. I want them to know the order of events. This led to this, led to that. You know,
yeah.
so the relative dating, I guess you could say, the general order of things, so they can understand cause and effect and all of that. But I'm not like, in what year did this happen? Um, not as much. Yeah, there's also a tendency to move away from the traditional, just talking about kings and their wars and
Mm,
that kind of the political history. I mean, there's still a lot of interest in political history, and I'm interested in it too. But there's more interest now in let's do other histories, right? Let's find out what's going on, among the common people. What were they doing? It's harder to know because they weren't writing a lot of times. But let's find out let's explore areas that haven't been explored as much. What was the life of women like, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's been a great thing about history, because in history, you're always encouraged as a scholar to explore new things,
Yeah.
right? Do something different. And that has caused people to reach out into these other directions, which makes the history even fuller. And you get to learn more about these societies than you knew before. So it's a good thing.
Can we talk about women and just other kind of, marginalized groups? So could you tell me like about, how women were treated in ancient history? And obviously I'm sure it's going to be very different based on the region and the civilization.
It is very different, yes. However, I can tell you this, generally speaking, um, in ancient times, and when I say ancient times, I'm talking about from the beginning of writing, because that's history technically starts at the beginning of writing, because historians study
Hmm.
documents. So anything before writing is prehistory, and that's the anthropology department. Anyway,
Yeah.
but from the beginning of writing up through the end of ancient times, like around maybe 600 of the Common Era, it's a long time. We have just pretty much all patriarchal societies. Okay, men are running things, and it's a shame. It'd be nice to be able to. Let's see if there's anything else.
Yeah.
That's how it was, and which means women were not treated that well. They didn't have equal rights. They never, in any ancient society I've ever studied, women have not had equal rights.
Really? There isn't one that you can think of.
There isn't one. Now, there are some that are better than others.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example. Ancient Egypt is usually considered an example of a society where the women were treated better. They had more legal rights and more freedoms than elsewhere. And then it's interesting, because when the ancient Greeks came to Egypt and they began ruling it, they were on the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
They treated their women terribly, okay? And they're looking at the Egyptian women, they're like, looking down on them. And it's an interesting clash of two cultures, right? The way that they thought of women. And in fact, even when the Greeks were ruling Egypt, Greek women in Egypt had fewer rights than Egyptian women in Egypt,
Wow.
even though the Greeks were the rulers. Yeah,
That's so
because it was their
fascinating.
culture. Yeah.
What about so okay, with ancient Greece, like one of my problems for the longest time I was just not interested in ancient Greece. And I think it was probably I don't know if the right word is transference, right? But I had like this inherent bias because when I read primary sources from ancient Greece, especially when they talked about women. Sorry?
Eris is a Greek name, I believe.
Oh, yeah, it is. I ended up later falling in love with Greece, but initially, like, I'd always had this problem, because it felt like that. I mean, I'm used to tons of historical sources being very, very sexist. That's not abnormal, right? But it was, I guess, the misogyny that,
Yeah.
that was particularly, I don't want to say like unique to ancient Greece, because obviously, like, there were some forms of later Christianity and stuff that did that too. But yeah, like the way they spoke about women, especially, and correct me if I'm wrong, did they think that, was it a common idea that like women were not even like good enough to be lovers, or like to have sex with, or anything like that?
Well, as in any society, you're going to have a spectrum of opinions, right?
Hmm.
But there are people who wrote stuff like that, yes. um,
Yeah,
like,
there were like political. I don't know if this is the right term, but they were like politically homosexual. Like that's what I
yeah,
heard.
and it's funny, because it's hard to put, like, you don't want to put modern labels on the
Mm,
sexuality of
yeah.
ancient people, because it's very difficult because they view it differently than we do today. But yeah, in Greece was known, the men were known to, I guess in today's terms we'd call them bisexual or something, but they had sex with both men and women. They were expected to be married and have children, and they did
Hmm.
that. Okay, but they also had relationships with men. But I'm sure you've heard of this before. Um, what we would call pedophilia was very common,
Hmm.
where older men would have mentor protege kind of relationships with young men. today would be under the age of consent, and having not only teaching them about life and so forth, you'd also have sex with them and all of that. And many men talk about that as being a great thing. Although there are men who complained about other men doing that to their sons. So yeah.
That's interesting. So there was
Yeah,
already like an idea of like, the potential harmful effects of it, I guess.
well, women were kept in the house. They weren't even, they weren't a good upstanding woman would not venture outside the house. Okay, that was the there was a saying in Greece. One man said that the boundary of a good woman's, I can't remember the exact word. It was something, the boundary of a good woman's domain is the front door, something like that. Yeah,
What a
and
quote.
even shopping was done by the men or by slaves. Yeah, because you don't want I think they didn't want their women out and around where other men could see them, or something. Very possessive. Now, if you were a lower class woman, slave or a prostitute or a foreigner, they wouldn't care so much, and they'd be out and around. But that wasn't the kind of woman that society respected. Now, I'm speaking, of course, about Athens because we know more
Yeah.
about Athens than any other Greek city, and we can't say for sure they all were like that, but maybe they probably had some of the same attitudes.
Yeah, I've heard the Spartans were better with women, but do we even know that, or is that just an idea?
We have information about Sparta that comes through Athens, so
Yeah,
be
no,
careful.
it's very biased.
Yeah, and also from later historians who heard legends and things like that. And they may or may not be true, but they were still patriarchal. You know, women for them were baby making machines, soldier baby making machines.
It's a slight improvement. I don't know.
Yes.
I'll take the W there.
The women have to work out and eat well so that the babies are strong.
So we don't have any independent sources, like I guess, like Spartan sources to talk about Sparta.
None. I mean, there are scattered inscriptions and things like that tell you very, very little. Most of our information comes from writers whose books were preserved, and a lot of the preserved works of literature are from Athenians, because Athens had the best as far as I guess that people thought in ancient times that the Athenians had the best art, the best writers, the best philosophers, all of
The
this
pinnacle
stuff.
of culture.
Right, and so that's why they preserved all their stuff and taught it in schools. And the other cultures, they didn't bother saving it. Sparta, though, wasn't really all that interested in the arts, so they probably didn't even have that many writers. So even one of the most famous poets of Sparta himself was a transplant from Athens. So, if I recall,
Yeah.
I get backward. Anyway, yeah. So that's a shame, but it's all we got.
What are the most? I mean, there's been a lot of movies made about Sparta. So what are the biggest misconceptions, I guess, about Sparta?
Yeah, I mean, movies like 300 and so forth. They're based on graphic novels more than on history.
Yeah.
But they have a historical kernel of truth. But I don't know if you ever saw 300, but
Yeah.
yeah, there are things in there that are accurate, like about even the way they did warfare and so it's somewhat accurate, especially the way the Spartans fought. But the way that the Persian army was represented, almost they really Lord of the Rings did up, which is exaggerated, like all these exotic fighters of various kinds. And the way that they portrayed Xerxes, the king of Persia, not anything like the real Xerxes. The way that they took the focus off of Athens for that war. That war was all about Athens. Sparta was just helping them out. Well, I shouldn't say that. Xerxes was invading all of Greece, but Athens was really one of the brains behind the whole thing, and it was their idea to have the Spartans go to Thermopylae in the first place. Also in the movie make it seem like the Spartans are fighting for democracy. They weren't pro-democracy.
Yeah, it's didn't they have kings?
Yeah. So, there are a lot of things in there that are anachronistic and so forth, but it was a lot of fun.
We talk a lot about monarchy on my channel, and something that was really unique about the Spartans, correct me if I'm wrong, that they had two kings normally.
Yeah.
right?
And I
So
guess
how did that work?
um, well, we don't know a ton about the intricacies of it. There were councils that the kings had to answer to and so forth.
So it
A
wasn't
lot.
an absolute monarchy.
It wasn't an absolute monarchy, and the idea of having two kings is to prevent absolute monarchy, right?
Mm.
Because you don't put all the power into one man's hands. Okay, there's two. But also, it was probably there for other reasons, like practical reasons, like if one of the kings wants to go and lead the army into battle, because they're expected to do that, and he gets killed, at least you got another king,
Yeah.
right? So I don't think they both would go out on campaign at the same time for that reason. And the Romans copied that idea when they started their republic. They had the consuls, who were the highest office in Rome before the empire.
Mm.
And there were two of them at the same time. And they would also take turns leading the army. So we think it was based on Sparta's system.
What are like the main differences between like I guess the consul system in Rome, having because they had a lot of power, right? Versus having two kings. Is it just aesthetics, or is there like a deeper
A king
difference?
definitely, a king definitely had more power than a consul. Consuls did not have the power of life and death over someone. It was taken away. The Romans used to have kings, and their kings had absolute power, and they could say, "Put that man to death" or whatever,
They
right?
were elected though, right? Roman kings.
Yeah, yeah. There were a couple that were from father to son, but mostly they were elected. Not by everybody. They were elected by, the higher ups.
The
But
patricians. Yeah.
yeah, but the they when they had the republic and they had consuls, deliberately they said the consuls do not have the power of life and death. They do not have absolute authority. They have to answer to the nobility, I guess, at that time. So they deliberately took that power away from them. Although they did make a provision for, in times of emergency, a dictator could be appointed and he would have the power of life and death, absolute power. But that would only last for 6 months. It ended up backfiring because,
Yeah, it's like with Caesar.
like people like Caesar and Sulla, people like that, ended up wanting to stay dictator. But that was the original plan anyway.
It's
But
funny how dictators always have like the same excuses for staying in power, right? That
yeah,
seems to be very common.
right. It's an emergency. Our civilization is under threat. So we
Yeah.
can't do it here. Yeah,
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 it's just temporary, guys, I swear, just for a long
yeah.
period.
Yes. But Sulla and Caesar both eventually had the Senate declare them perpetual dictators. But neither of them did last for very long.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, but what's interesting about Sparta's kings is though they didn't have absolute power either. They may have originally in the old days, but they didn't have absolute power either. But they probably did have more power than a Roman consul would have. There was a time in Greece where the period of the tyrants, for example, when there were men who rose up and had absolute power, and but that was it was in vogue for a while, but it eventually went by the wayside. People, didn't like it ultimately.
Um, I want to kind of go back to the women thing and other marginalized groups. Were and I mean, something in general when we portray ancient Greece, I mean, people like having women on screen and like movies and stuff. So I find that that's probably one of the most glaring inaccuracies that you see. Like women, like I know in, did you play did you play Assassin's Creed by any chance? I don't know if you played yet.
I didn't
Play
play
video games.
Assassin's Creed, no. But you know what? I've been kind of wanting to, but I just haven't gotten around to some of those games. I do play some ancient, like I play like Rome 2, Total War, and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have not played Assassin's Creed.
Well, so in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, that was the game that kind of made me fall in love with ancient Greece. And I know that there's tons of things that are inaccurate about it, and I'm sure there's lots of politics associated with it and stuff. But and this is kind of like a sensitive question, but something that I noticed was in the game, a lot of the characters, not everyone, but their skin would be very, very, very dark, way darker than I'd ever expected, or what the media often portrays. So everyone was like, "Oh, wait, there were black people in ancient Greece," all that stuff. Like, how accurate is that?
Well, I mean, the Mediterranean complexion is definitely darker than than
Hmm.
European complexion. Southern Italians are darker than even Northern Italians.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but so you have that, but also, especially if you were a soldier or a farmer and you're out in the sun a lot, you'd probably be even darker. I can't really look. I'm not looking at an image right now from Assassin's Creed, so I can't tell you. Um, but yeah, I mean, maybe they exaggerated. I don't know. But yeah, they wouldn't. We would still consider a Greek or an Italian or whatever white today, but it
Hmm.
doesn't mean that their skin is as light as like a Norwegian or something like that.
What
Yeah.
about like I mean there's a lot of times where people use history for their own like political ends, right? There's been like talks of Cleopatra not really being Greek, that she was really like an African queen or something like that.
Oh
Well,
yeah.
I guess technically she's an African queen, but
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
what I mean.
yeah. Well, there is a possibility that might have been on her mother's side. There was some African blood, or Egyptian blood, I guess. I guess that's African, northeastern African.
Hmm.
We're not sure. We're not positive. It's possible she was completely just Greek or Macedonian, but it's also possible that she wasn't. And there was a controversy, right, when they cast Wonder Woman, what's her name, Gal Gadot as Cleopatra, or they're working on a Cleopatra movie, I think, with Gal Gadot,
Yeah.
aren't they? Yeah, and a lot of people were mad that why didn't they use a woman of color? Um, I don't really have a dog in the fight here, but
Mm.
it's a possibility that Cleopatra did have, some African blood. We're just not sure.
Yeah, I always find that stuff challenging, especially when you're looking at something as far back as ancient history, because our concepts of race right now, like, just did not, our concepts of race and just the categorization of ethnicities, like, even with like Arabs and Muslims and Christians, all that stuff, especially during that time period, did not really exist. So it seems kind of weird to me to put people. I totally understand like why people would want, say, like, a modern trans woman to be playing a trans character in like the 20th century. But
Mhm.
for that, like, yeah, that particular controversy, I just did not understand the issue.
If it were in a vacuum, it'd be a little different, right? If it was like, we've never made a Cleopatra movie before and we're going to do one now, it probably wouldn't be. But I think when you have a history of always in all these, like in Bible movies, and every time they do something on Egypt, everybody seems to be white,
Hmm.
traditionally, and it's only been in more recent times that they haven't. So I can understand why you want to buck against the trend. You're like, come on, if it's possible that Cleopatra was a woman of color, then let's just do it. All this, Elizabeth Taylor already played her. Let's do something different. So I can understand why people would want to like go against what's been traditionally done in movies and try something different. Um, but if it were just you never done it before and like we didn't have this history of what they call whitewashing in movies, then it probably wouldn't be a big deal at all.
That's actually a really good point. Um, what do you have any favorite like movies or TV shows historically, like things that are like, I guess, the most accurate that you could think of?
Well, my favorite and the most accurate are not necessarily the same
Oh,
thing.
yeah, that's a good point.
Like a lot of people hate the Alexander the Great movie. Uh, was it yeah by
With
Oliver? Yeah, with
Colin
Colin
Farrell.
Farrell. But boy, they followed the stories pretty well. You know, it just isn't really that great of a movie. So you have that on the one hand. Then you
Yeah,
have something like
people
which
complain that his hair was blonde and it looked weird. I was like, isn't one of the most famous things about Alexander the Great that he had blonde hair?
yeah, but Colin Farrell has very dark hair
Yeah,
in real life, and you could just tell it was a dye job. But
it definitely looked weird.
uh, yeah, a movie like Troy is entertaining, but it irritates me because they don't follow the story very well at all.
Hmm.
Uh, they tried taking all the gods out of it, which is like a major part of the story, which so I didn't like that. Um, I love movies though, like Gladiator. Now, Gladiator is about a completely fictional character. Maximus is not a real character, but Commodus, the emperor, and all that is, and that's kind of cool. I enjoyed that, even though they added a scene in there where Commodus kills his father, but that's not historical. But it's still
But
a fun
Commodus
movie.
is kind of infamous. Do you think like he
Oh yeah,
was
yeah,
portrayed in, I guess, an accurate way, like with his villainy?
yeah. It was fairly accurate. He was kind of like that. You know, um, that movie. A lot of people don't know this, and I actually have not heard anyone else say this, but I noticed it. There is a movie from the '60s called The Fall of the Roman Empire, which is very similar to Gladiator.
Really?
And I'm like, Gladiator ripped this movie off. But no one ever said, like, Gladiator's copying this movie. I don't know why. Now, there's differences, and the '60s movie is, like, a lot longer, but it's kind of the same story. And I was like, no one mentioned that. I don't know why.
Well, have one of my first introductions as a kid to ancient Rome. I'm Jewish, so I was always taught when I was growing up ancient Rome from like a Jewish perspective.
Ah,
So from, or as you would say, a Jewish lens, right?
yeah,
And so I remember watching Ben-Hur, and my dad would always say like, "Oh, just don't listen to the Jesus part, right? Ignore that part." But that guy, he's Jewish, right? Like, and so like, how accurate is Ben-Hur?
oh, it's been so long since I've seen it. There's a lot in there that's completely fictional, right?
Something I remember, there was like a thing.
In the historical setting. I guess we
Yeah.
would call it historical fiction, right? Where you just set it in historical times. But I can't remember now everything about it.
Well, there's a scene that I remember very distinctly, like as a kid, how the lepers were treated, right? Or people with leprosy, because that was a big part of, I guess, how Jesus demonstrated how good of a person he was. So, because he like walked in, and so like they were kept in like some kind of cave. That's what I remember in the movie. How accurate is that?
I doubt that that's very accurate. I mean, yeah, obviously they would have been kept away from everyone else. I wish I could remember the scene. So I can't really comment too much on it. But I think if they had him in a cave and all of that, I don't know how. It doesn't sound like it would be very accurate.
Well, did they keep people with leprosy? I don't know if the term leper is offensive, actually. The woke Twitter hasn't told me yet. But did they keep people with leprosy like very separate? Like, did they understand the basics?
This goes all the way back to the biblical times. That now, when we say leprosy today, we're often referring to a specific disease.
Hmm.
But in ancient times, they just meant pretty much all kinds of skin ailments.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, and it would be temporary for a lot of them. Like, you got eczema or anything. It could be considered leprosy,
Yeah.
and you weren't allowed. Here's the important part. And I'm talking about ancient Israel now, and I'm sure if this carries over into Jesus times, but you weren't allowed to go to the tabernacle or to the temple. Okay, get too close to it, because the closer you get to God, right, the worse it is, because you contaminate. You have to be
Hmm.
as pure as possible. That's why only the priest could even go into the inner sanctum and all that. So imperfections of any kind are going to disqualify you. So skin problems are going to disqualify you from being able to get too close. Okay. Um, some forms, I think, of skin diseases might even segregate you from society in general. It'd have to be pretty bad, you know. But even smaller, minor ailments would exclude you from going to the temple or something like that. So there's different kinds of segregation, I guess you could call it, quarantining that they had. They knew that some of it was contagious. I don't know if they knew that others were not, but
So they
um,
didn't have an understanding of, like, I mean, obviously germ theory gets invented or discovered much. Sorry, I shouldn't have said
yeah,
invented. Much later, but so they didn't. But they didn't have. Did they have any kind of basic idea of germ theory?
I think they knew that things could spread. I don't think that they knew how. You know,
Mhm.
yeah.
I
Um,
know that in the early medieval period, they start, or the early Middle Ages, they start, especially in Europe, they got rid of bathhouses. That was like a big thing. In Europe, they infamously stopped bathing and instead start washing their clothes a lot. So when Was that like an accurate view? I think one of the concerns was that ancient that like bathhouses, particularly in Rome, they spread homosexuality, right? But more importantly, they were thought of to spread diseases. Was that like true?
Gee, I haven't looked into this much at all. It could be. Um, I don't. I mean, bathhouses were around for most of Roman history,
Hmm.
but maybe it changed in Christian times. It's possible later
Okay.
on. But I think they would have gotten rid of them for moral reasons rather than health reasons.
Sounds like
Yeah,
the early Middle Ages.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, and also, this is yeah, a lot of people. I've been hearing this a lot, just vaguely when people talk about trans people in general. That trans people have always existed. And of course, we can't. It's bad to use, our current day terms to describe, historical behaviors. But was there anything like someone being trans in the ancient world?
Yeah, I guess it's just hard to know because, like, let's say someone today who sees that they're not the gender that they were assigned at birth or whatever, right?
Hmm.
They have the choice to do something about it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in ancient times, there would be a lot of reasons. I mean, even in our world, 100 years ago, you wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Most people wouldn't do it. They would just say, "Well, I'm just going to live the life that people are expecting me to live. I don't want to go through that hassle." And that probably was like that in ancient times too. But there were in ancient times people who did buck against trends and things like that. There were now I'm across the spectrum of LGBTQ, right? There were people that we would call queer, but the categories are not the same as our categories. So it's kind of difficult to say, well, this equals that, and this equals this. In other words, if they use this word to identify themselves in Latin, that means a trans person. Well, that's kind of hard to do. You can't really do that, because the boundaries are all different. So
Hmm.
um, I just don't know enough about the subject to be able to tell you, but I would say there were definitely people that were trans, because you can be trans without letting anyone know that you're trans,
Yeah.
obviously. So yeah, of course there were, because there always are, but how you identify them and all that's very difficult. I couldn't really tell you like a historical person, like, oh, see this person here, they were trans.
Hmm.
I can't do that. I don't
How
know if
is the ancient concept of like gender and sex different than how we regard it now?
well, it depends, of course, on the culture.
Hmm.
Um, but gender roles have, exist everywhere, and they're slightly different in the various countries. But like, this is the way men are supposed to behave, and this is the way women are supposed to behave. And it wasn't the same as sexuality in ancient times either, because um, in ancient Rome, for example, right? If you were a man in ancient Rome, okay, you it was perfectly acceptable in their society to have sex with other men, okay, but it wasn't acceptable to not act like a man. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Um, so like in a same-sex relationship, if a man acted like a woman in that relationship, they were looked down upon.
Hmm.
But if they were acting like the man in that relationship, they were not looked down upon.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so
Um,
it's more about the way that you presented yourself, right, than it was the actual sex.
mhm. Um, is there? I'm thinking like, uh, is there like a favorite story in general that you really really loved about in ancient history? Any kind of like narrative where there's like a hero or a villain or something like
Oh,
that.
so it doesn't have to be a true story.
Um, no, it should be a true. It should be a true one. I know
Uh,
there are lots of great untrue ones.
True story from ancient times that I just love to read about. Let's see. Boy, that's a good question. It's like asking someone their favorite movie. It's
Yeah.
kind of a story. I guess I'm gonna have to pick a country, then I have to pick the story. I love telling stories, in class and all that, but a lot of times the best stories are the ones that aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll say, and I'll
Because they
tell them
tell
anyway.
deeper truths, right?
Right? Yeah, this is a funny thing because like historians study fictional stories,
Mm-hmm.
and I tell my class this. I'm like, well, wait a minute, why are they studying this epic of Gilgamesh? Or if you're saying Gilgamesh never did any of this, that's not why you study the story. You study the story to find out about the people who wrote it, like what they valued, right? What they thought was important or not important. You're like, this story embodies the values of this culture, and you learn about this culture from the story. So it's still worthwhile from a historical perspective, even though the story's not true, right? So anyway, notice how I'm trying to get around your question so I don't have to answer it.
It's a hard question deciding what your favorite thing, like, yeah, because one of my favorite things to do on my channel is to just tell interesting stories that people often don't talk about. Because some of them can be sad, or a lot of them can be really funny. Uh,
Herodotus, the Greek historian,
mhm.
uh, notable in his work of history, he repeats stories in his history book that he himself says he doesn't believe. Like, but I heard it, so I thought I should tell you. So then he does that a lot. He'll go like,
Yeah.
"Well, someone told me this story. I don't believe it, but here's the story," and he tells it to you. I do that in my class too. I'm like, this is probably not true, but this is what is said.
Yeah, because it gets you like in the mode imagining what it was like. Um,
Yeah,
with Herodotus, I forget, is that how you pronounce it? Herodotus?
probably. I say Herodotus, but that's my
Herodotus.
yeah way of saying a Greek word. But yeah.
Because he wrote so much, I think he's also one of the main sources on Sparta as well,
Hmm.
right? But because he's such a major source at the time. Do you ever feel like when you read those sources, and this is a super weird question, do you ever feel like some kind of like parasocial relationship with him? Like, or is this common like with
Oh,
historians when
like
they're reading
historian
so much?
too.
Yeah, so much of someone's thoughts and everything.
Yeah, I suppose so. I get it more with Thucydides.
Oh, why is that?
I think because he's trying harder to be accurate.
Mm,
Um, even though he himself says, this conversation didn't happen exactly like I'm saying it, but or no, he says, I don't know the exact words that people use in this conversation, but here's how it might have gone.
yeah.
Tell you. But he makes a point in his history of trying to be accurate, whereas Herodotus, like I said, he'll just repeat a story because he heard it. So I think I identify a little bit more with Thucydides, but I understand what you mean. Yeah, when you look at historians of the past, you kind of like, hey, if I lived back then, I might have been the guy who wrote this, or
Yeah,
something.
like is there a part of you that's like, that feels kind of proud to be participating in this weird human
Sure,
tradition, that has been going on for thousands of years of,
yeah.
recording and studying this stuff?
Well, yeah, history writing is a form of preservation, right?
Hmm.
You're trying to preserve things so they don't get lost, right? If I don't get this down, people might forget about it,
Yeah, and
right?
that's the worst thing.
Yeah. Oh, it's just part of my historical mindset. I also do my family genealogy and all that,
Oh,
and
cool.
I'm obsessed with like getting stories from family members because I'm working on my parents right now, but because like when they're gone, it's going to be gone. Like
Hmm.
it's not going to be there anymore. I got to preserve it. The information. And
Yeah.
I don't know why I think the information is so important, but I'm like, but if it's going to be destroyed, I mean, you have to preserve it. Um, so yeah, I feel that way. That's what historians do in general. They're trying to get things down before they're forgotten. That's how I look at it anyway.
Um, one of when I was in my undergrad, my first year, I was in like this history students kind of society thing, and I think I said something. I think I quoted Marx or something with his slow march to progress idea, and I was quoting Hegel. Sorry, and I think Marx also like kind of described this idea of human society always moving in this upward direction towards progress and stuff. And all the older students just like screamed at me, "Wig, wig," right? And then they made me wear a sweatshirt that on the back said "wig." So, could is that like an issue with ancient history like as well? The idea of like wig history.
I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're asking.
Oh,
What,
I don't
what,
know if it's a concept that's more common in more modern history. But just like the idea that history is always, you know how people always say things like history teaches us this, or this is a lesson from history, or history is always in this upwards kind of trajectory towards progress. Like, you know, I heard that that's a problematic way to look at
I
history.
certainly don't think that um, history has, when people have been forced to take history for years,
Yeah.
but we keep repeating the same mistakes. I don't see how it like really helps. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Uh, what's the famous phrase about, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. But I think they're doomed to repeat it anyway.
Yeah, it's just
Uh,
gonna happen. It's human nature.
they keep doing it. I do think it is instructive and it can help make informed decisions, but I don't think that people automatically are going to make good decisions by studying history because they take history all through school. They still do. I mean, even on a smaller level, how many times have you said like, oh man, I'm not going to act like my dad or my mom when I grow up. I'm going to do this, and then you find yourself doing what they do. Right?
Yep.
You're like, I can't believe I said that. That's what my dad would say, or whatever, right? And it's like that with history. And the brother, you're like, oh, look at those people who did that stupid thing back then. We won't be that dumb, and then we do it. So I don't think we necessarily are going to solve problems by studying history, but I do think that people who take it seriously and who want to learn from history, can um, benefit from that and avoid mistakes. It's just that we have the tendency not to. I guess it's more about human nature than it is about the study of history that I'm talking about. But
What I see more often, especially like I studied the 20th century, and especially in the early 20th century with the advent of like fascism and everything, it's much more so people misusing history. For example, there's like one of the big aspects of fascism was like appropriating, ancient Roman aspects of ancient Roman culture. Like, and I think they invented the idea of like the salute, where they thought that salute that was a part of Roman culture, and the eagle and like all that kind of stuff. Is that frustrating for you to see, the stuff that you love to read about kind of, especially even today, get used by like hate groups?
I kind of go both ways on it because I have a mixed view. Because on the one hand, yeah, it's like, oh man, people are getting this wrong. That's terrible. But on the other hand, if they don't, then I don't have anything to talk about. So it's like
Yeah.
I like being able to say, hey, did you know? I hate to be the actually guy, but I'm like, actually,
Yeah, but that's the fun thing to do.
right? Yeah. And people like hearing that. People love it when they're like, I always thought that was true, and then you tell them it's not. They kind of like
Yeah.
learning that. Wow, I didn't know I was wrong all these years. Um,
Hmm.
so, and that's kind of fun to do. Um, it's also fun to bring things up that people never heard of before, didn't know about. I like teaching things to people that, well, that's another thing about ancient Near Eastern history. It's not like Greek and Roman history. Ancient Near Eastern history, you mentioned famous figures from Mesopotamia or, whatever. People have never heard of them. So I like teaching history that people never heard about. Like, here's some famous people that you don't know about.
Yeah. What
So
are
it's
like
fun.
some cool people in like in Near East history that we don't know about?
Um, yeah, let's see. I'll say it can start early, but there's like famous Sumerian kings you could talk about besides Gilgamesh. There. Oh, who I enjoy talking about is Shamshi-Adad, who was the founder of the original Assyrian, I guess you'd call it Assyrian empire or state or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, there are people like Gudea of Lagash, who there's all kinds of images of in museums and things, but no one ever talks about him. People have heard of Hammurabi, but they don't know much about Hammurabi. He's always fun to talk about too. Um, you have certain Assyrian emperors from the Neo-Assyrian period. Tiglath-Pileser III, for example. Uh, Sargon. Well, there's Sargon of Akkad. People have heard of him
Yeah,
because of the YouTuber,
because of
but
the YouTuber. Could you tell me a bit about Sargon of Akkad, like the real
real
Sargon of
Sargon.
Akkad?
Yeah, he He is the founder of what you could call the very first empire in history, right?
Oh,
Uh,
cool.
I'm defining empire loosely to mean when a state expands outside of its own land, right, into other people's land.
Hmm.
So I'm calling it an empire. So this is kind of the first time that that's really done, where he is venturing out from Akkad, which is in southern Mesopotamia, into these other regions in the northern Mesopotamia, into the Levant, and all of this, and forms this first ever empire that becomes sort of the model for future empires. Future empires of the Near East are going to copy Sargon's administration, how he set things up, the governors, all of that. And indeed, even to this very day, there are aspects of empire that can be traced back to those times, because you're like, you just do what the last guy did, you know. Um, he even changed the language of the Near East, because he made Akkadian, his language, the common language, the lingua franca of the
Hmm.
Near East, and it will remain the main language of the Near East for 1,000 years, long after his empire is even gone. Um,
Why
so,
were empires so common in the period?
well, before his time they weren't, but when he started
Hmm.
that, people always wanted to be him,
Yeah.
right? They're like, look at the great thing that he did, you know, we got to do that.
It
People try.
reminds me a lot of how European monarchs later would always call themselves some form of Caesar, right? Like
Yeah,
Kaiser, Czar.
they want to bring back those glory days, I guess, yeah, they want to be the emperor,
Yeah, like make Europe great again, like that.
yes, exactly. um
Very, very common human instinct. It's really funny.
it is, yeah, it is. And also, but also the reason for having an empire is you get control of a lot of resources, you get rich, people like power, you get bragging rights, and there's all kinds of reasons why you might like an empire. um but
Mm.
um but then everybody wants to do it. Yeah. And then, of course, it leads to larger and larger armies. At first, you only need this many men. Then somebody makes an army that's bigger. Then you have to make a
That's true.
bigger army, and then they have to make a
So
bigger
there's like
army.
an incentive structure to,
Yeah.
for empires.
Mhm.
Later in the 19th century and definitely in the early 20th century after World War I, like there was huge pushes towards like nationalist movements. Was there ever, and as these empires started to fall, was there any kind of moment like that in ancient history, like times of nationalism and people having
Not
self-determination?
at least not in the Near East and the Mediterranean world. There may have been some of that maybe in China, but uh, yeah, they don't really think that way. It's kind of a more modern idea, about
Hmm.
about a nation being comprising an ethnic group, right? Or a certain type of people, like this
Yeah.
nation, right? Self-determination, all that. That wasn't really the way they thought in ancient times at all. And I mean, there wasn't a lot of travel in ancient times in general, but there were migrations, people coming in from different places, and there were prejudices against people from other places, no doubt about that. But and there were wars. Like I think of the famous wars on the Germanic frontier for Rome, trying to keep the barbarians out and things like that.
Hmm.
Um, it isn't. I don't know if it was so much an ethnic thing, though. I don't think it was like, well, we don't want any Germans in the Roman Empire. I don't think it was that at all. Um,
Was it
it was
more
more,
about culture than anything and language?
yeah, I think it was about culture, um, a bit about language, also just about general security and things like that. But it wasn't really so much about ethnicity. Although, you do have the Greeks referring to people as barbarians and looking down on them and things like that. But again, it was more cultural, because they embraced Alexander and the Macedonians as Greek when before they didn't, right? They're actually changing what it means to be Greek. They're
Hmm.
saying those Macedonians aren't Greek. Until then, the Macedonians conquer you, and then you're like, you're Greek. It's
Yeah.
like, it's kind of interesting.
In some weird way, it's kind of progressive, right? Um, yeah, bad term to use, but yeah. There's when we look when you look at like say something like ancient Rome, I've heard plenty of times that our concept of race right now, like white people, black people, brown people, like that, all those categories, they're obviously not real scientific ideas. But I heard that they got invented, like that concept gets invented in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. Because there was also scientific racism and all that stuff. So, what were like the conceptions of what we would consider race now in ancient times?
Um,
Like, how did they divide human beings? All
I
that
would
stuff.
probably tell you, yeah, I would probably say that the idea of race didn't exist.
Hmm.
There were concepts of ethnicity, which is usually um, described as having to do with genealogy, right? So,
Yeah.
like, I'm thinking, of course, in the Bible that this is very much the case where different uh, groups of people from different parts of the earth are connected through genealogy. The ancient
They like
Israelites,
share the same ancestor and
yeah,
everything.
like the ancient Israelites had neighbors, right, to other countries that were around them, and they expressed their relationship to them in a genealogical sense. These are cousins. These are brothers. In other words, they're kind of showing how closely related they are to them through the genealogical relationship. Um, so, like Edom, which was a country to the south, they thought of as more closely related to them than, say, Moab and Ammon, who are nearby as well, but they're also related, but not as closely related. So it's showing some sort of ethnic understanding of them, right? How closely related you are to them, and the further away in relation they are, the more they look down upon them. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Yeah. So there is a concept of ethnicity and this idea of being prejudiced against other ethnicities that definitely existed, but I wouldn't call it race.
Yeah, that's if say there was what we would consider a black person today was in ancient Rome for whatever reason, but they cut their hair short the way the Romans liked it. They spoke Latin and all that stuff. Would they be treated equally as like a Roman citizen?
I would say, yeah, for the most part, I think so. Um, I mean, prejudices existed. There's no
Hmm.
doubt about it against foreigners in general. So, in other words, I would say there would be there would be prejudice against someone from Africa, but it would be of the same type as a prejudice against someone from Persia or from even from Greece. You know what I'm saying? Or certain areas
Yeah.
where like, well, you're not one of us. You know what I'm saying? So
It's
there's
like
a
everyone's equal under the Romans kind of
right,
attitude. There's no
right.
like tier list.
We're equally discriminated against.
Yeah, it sounds
But
really
you could,
progressive.
yes. I mean, but you could theoretically, as an African, just as much as any other kind of barbarian, go through the ranks of the Romans' army and so forth, and work your way up just like anybody else. You know,
Hmm.
so it is still possible to advance in that society, um, regardless of it. So it wasn't about skin color so much as about just not being Roman, and you could actually assimilate and become Roman and definitely be more accepted for sure.
Were
Well,
there
yeah,
any other?
oh yeah,
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead. I
Um,
was okay.
yeah, you go ahead. You go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say like there are times when like even people were made citizens of ancient Rome. Who were of foreign nationalities, and the more you go, the further in time you get, you'll start to see emperors who are not even Italian anymore, coming from other places, and
Hmm.
that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah. So yeah, it was very much focused much more on culture
Hmm.
um, and all of that. So I guess like the fear, because I mean the way the Romans spoke about the barbarians, like or like the Germans, they spoke about them with a lot of like disgust, right, or like fear. So it was much more related to, you know, I guess the aspects of their culture.
Yeah, although not all. I mean, like in later Roman times, you'll even see former barbarians or Germanic people in the Roman army, and they got like a Roman uniform on. but they've got like long blonde hair and big bushy beards,
Mm,
and jewelry and stuff.
yeah.
And so they're still retaining aspects of their culture, but they now, um, so certain things over time, I guess, get accepted. It's gradual, but I think if a person showed up like that in earlier Roman times, it wouldn't have been quite the same.
Um, in general, like what are when you're trying to if you're just like an average person, like you're not like a scholar or something like that, and you're trying to learn more about some aspect in history, or just like a basic question, like what I just asked, what's the direction, right, or the tools that the average person can use to research that, like when they're googling and all that stuff.
Oh, I see. So trying to find out more information about any ancient subject,
Yeah,
you mean?
and do it in a responsible way. Yeah.
Yeah. The idea that what you want to do is try to find out what the consensus is on a particular subject. And nowadays on the internet, it's very easy to get into, fall into a hole where you're into a minority opinion
Hmm.
or something out of the mainstream, and they're presenting it as if it's true. You got to find out, like, wait a minute, now is this what most historians are saying, or is this kind of a fringe idea? And you sometimes don't know, right? And the best place to get, I hate to say this because I know it's not perfect. I know it messes up. It has things that are wrong in it. You can't take it as 100% gospel truth here, but Wikipedia
Yeah,
is actually
Wikipedia.
very helpful because of the fact that people all can go in and chime in, but it reviews itself. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
That people who know about the subject are involved in the editing of it, and generally speaking, it's going to be, fringe ideas are going to be weeded out. Or if someone throws in a fringe idea, someone else is going to say something about it.
Yep.
So it's not a bad place to start. Okay. Textbooks are also a great place. Things that are used in college classrooms because they tend to be surveys of the consensus of what
Hmm.
most people think. So textbooks are good too. Again, not perfect, but they tend to give you the general consensus on various things. But the consensus is always updating itself, so don't get a book that's too old.
Yeah, that was one of my first lessons. I've always been obsessed with history, and when I and so people would always get me like these old historical books, right? Uh, because like for example, the fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbons, right? And they'd be like, "Well, this is the book," and you think because it's so old, right? I mean, I guess it's from the 18th century, it's so accurate, but it's more often it's the opposite, right? Like it's when you're dealing with with a historian, like the older, the less accurate it is. Could you explain like kind of why that is?
Yeah, and it's the same thing with science, right? Or medicine.
Hmm.
It's funny because I often get criticized, or historians get criticized. They're like, well, you were wrong about this in the past, and you were wrong about that, and you were wrong about the other thing.
Yeah.
You're not trustworthy. But the fact is that we historians are updating all the time, right? That's a good thing, right? That when we recognize when we are
Hmm.
wrong, we change, right? If we were just to dig in and say, like, I'm never going to admit an error, and we're always right no matter what, we're infallible, that's not a historian that you can trust, right? The fact that we are updating ourselves and saying, you know what, we used to think this, but guess what? We were wrong, and it's actually this. That's a good thing. That's a sign that the profession is trustworthy, because when it finds a mistake, it
It
corrects
correct.
the mistake, right?
Hmm.
And it updates the books, you know. So so it's not a negative. I don't know if that answered your question or not. I
No, I
forgot what.
did. The
Okay.
so I guess but some of those ideas, especially with like 18th century style historians, uh, the way I mean, there was a huge push in general in the 18th century towards moving away from Christian thought and logical and rational thinking and all that stuff with the Enlightenment. So when historians wrote, like Edward Gibbons, you know, that that bias always was put in that time. Are you ever like aware of the way our modern period is affecting your work?
Oh yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, there's a whole movement within history that's even questioning the idea of whether objectivity is possible, right?
Yeah.
Because we're all a product of our environment. And still quite a number of historians, myself included, who argue, well, even though we cannot be completely objective, we should at least try to be as objective as possible. But there are others who argue that it's impossible. So, might as well embrace it. And I'm
Yeah.
not on that school, but
Yeah, I'm
that
not
is,
either.
it is a big, a big part of the history profession of questioning our own objectivity. And yes, but it is true. I agree that we're all biased, and
Mhm.
that's why you can't trust one historian. You have to get all the range of
You want to go to
opinions,
consensus, yeah.
right? And also, why you know that things could change in the future, and we could find out, we were wrong about something. But if you're not an expert, here's the thing: if you're a historian, then of course, if you know about the subject, then disagree. Go ahead, disagree with the history consensus. You could say, you know what, the consensus is wrong. That's good because it engages the history people, and it gets more people thinking about the subject. But if you are a non-expert, okay, to be able to say like, well, I'm going to go with this minority opinion. I believe them over the consensus. That's more dangerous because you don't know the subject. This
Mhm.
guy could be fooling you, So if you're not going to be a historian and you're not going to put forth the effort to do all the research, it's safe to go with the consensus, right? Yes, it may not be right, but it is more likely to be right than some person over on the side who thinks everybody else is wrong.
When I often appeal to historical consensus in a debate or something, a very common response that I'll get is, "Oh, you're just arguing. That's a logical fallacy. That's an appeal to authority." How should I respond to that?
um,
Give me some tricks.
yeah. Okay, so I did a video on logical fallacies just recently.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. As far as appeal to authority, there's an appeal to authority fallacy, and then there's an appeal to authority that actually is a good appeal to authority. When it's a fallacy, is when you say, you should believe this because it's so and so who said it, right? And
Mhm.
you have no other reasons, right? In other words, well, this important historian said it, therefore it's true. That's a fallacy because that's not proof of something, okay? But to say, I'm going to cite this expert on the subject. This expert on the subject studied this and they came to this conclusion as evidence for a claim. It might not be your only evidence, but it is a form of evidence. That's perfectly fine because here you are citing an authority on the subject. He's done a lot of research on it. That adds weight to the position, but you can't hang all of it on that, right? You got to judge the argument on its own terms. So it's only a fallacy when it is you're hanging all of your faith on that one aspect of it, that it's the authority who said it, so let's just believe it. That is a fallacy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Have you ever encountered have you ever had an experience like that where someone just told you, oh, like you're just appealing to authority? Because that's such a misconception.
Yeah, that happens. That has happened to me in the comments of YouTube videos and things like that. Just for me, like referring to an expert on the subject and who said such and such, and like, oh, appeal to authority, huh?
So what are some other historical fallacies or logical fallacies that historians or anyone who's into history can fall into? Because you said you did a whole video on this. So.
Yeah, I did a video on. I'm going to probably do a follow-up video as well.
Oh, cool.
But so sometimes you'll get things like the possible proof argument, which is like I see this sometimes with the lost ancient high technology people, where someone will argue for the possibility that something could have happened, but act like that's proof that it did happen, right? So they'll say like, well, it's certainly possible. The argument is that something is possible. It could have happened, right? And then as if that's enough to say that it did happen. But arguing that it's possible is not arguing that it's probable, right? That's two different things. And so you shouldn't get them confused. So that's one fallacy. Another one would be there's the historian's fallacy, as it's sometimes called, where you, where you um, you judge a past event or person or the choices that they made based on your own understanding of the world, right? In modern times. Now we have we have hindsight. We know things that happen, but to judge someone who did something in the past based on our own I thoughts about things is not fair. You have to kind of put yourself in the historical context.
Hmm.
Uh, or where you say like, well, why would they do something like that? We all know blah blah blah. Well, you're already biased because you're committing the historian's fallacy. You're judging by today's standards.
Hmm.
So that sometimes that happens as well. Um, what other ones are there that I brought out? Let's see. Uh, I don't have it in front of me. The list I sometimes
Oh no, that's
forget.
fine.
But
What are like what do you do when there's I often encounter this in my studies like or in my research like when I'm dealing normally with Israeli sources and some Jordanian sources and they often contradict one another. So what happens when you have two sources that are just completely contradictory? Like what's your process for deciphering which source is more reliable? Or is
oh
that
yeah.
even possible?
Well, it's not foolproof, obviously. It's part of the historical method. You do this all the time, right? You collect these witnesses to an event, and like this one says this, and this one says the opposite. What is it? But you look where there's agreement. First of all, well, they both say and agree that this happened. They don't interpret it the same way, but they both agree that it happened. So that's probably true, right? We know that probably happened, and that they're interpreting it differently.
Hmm.
But if it's just one person's word against another, you need either a third witness, or if you can understand a little bit about their biases, maybe one of the witnesses that you have has certain biases that and they would expect from them, and when they fall into those biases, well, that's kind of from their bias. But if they give evidence of something that seems to go against their own bias, it might be more reliable, right? Because you're like, well, they wouldn't make this up because it doesn't further their own agenda, and they're
Yeah.
saying, so maybe it's more reliable. So things like that. But there are different criteria you can use to kind of sift through things to this might be more probable or this might be less probable. But sometimes it's just one person's word against another, and you just have to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know?
Um and I guess like that's where someone can do a peer review and give some criticism about valuing one source over the other. Like that's often one of the big ways that can happen. Um
Yeah.
so like uh is there any frustration from you because there's so much like people think when you go and you study history and you get your PhD it's all about studying history itself, but you're often studying historiography, right? Like how to be a historian. You're gaining the tools and all that stuff and how to practice the historical method. So does it ever like frustrate you that people who haven't done that kind of process, that formal process in university, call themselves historians like on the internet?
Um, does it bother me? I don't know if it completely bothers me. It bothers me when they make egregious errors or something like that because
Mm-hmm.
they lack a knowledge about a certain thing. Um, Certainly, when you have a well-rounded education, you can avoid a lot of pitfalls, and you know how to do the history a little bit more efficiently and more convincingly and so forth. Um, but I'm kind of the opinion that um, you don't have to go to university to be a good historian. Um, that if you go through the same kind of training, you don't need the paper that says you have a degree. And I think people can teach themselves. They have to learn from others, to know how to teach themselves. I think it can be done, and I think that's fine. Um, but of course, if you make mistakes, you're also going to be called out on it.
How does someone go about, like, say they want to, they want to learn about history, but they want to be really responsible with it, and do it in, out of the formal education system? Like, how would they go about that in your view?
It's good to, well, obviously you have to do a lot of reading on the subject of historiography and things like that to know sort of where the field is on this, and how to do it right. But
Mm-hmm.
also you might want to get a mentor, somebody who's been there and done that and who can teach. It'd be like any other craft, let's say I want to teach myself how to be a plumber or whatever. Okay. I can get books on plumbing that help me, but
Yeah.
also I can get a plumber to show me how to do it, so those are ways that it can be done. It's basically the university is providing that for you. I mean, no doubt about it. Here you are in the midst of a bunch of experts who are going to train you, and not just one, but several of them, and they're going to train. This is like really the best way to do it. I'm just saying that's not the only way to do it. And also, it's more expensive. So, yeah, but I would say that would be the place to start. The thing about studying under one mentor, the problem with that is whatever that one person's faults are going to be instilled into you.
Yeah, like you're mirroring all of that back.
So it's good to get a lot of different viewpoints on this. But even like in a program like I was in my university, there was a certain personality to my group of professors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there were professors at other universities that had a different way of doing things, right? So I like to, even though I learned all the ways that my professors said that this is the way to do it, I still wanted to find out how other people were doing it and compare and say, oh, is this way really the best way?
Yeah.
Even going through the university program, it's still good to widen out and find out what others are doing.
This is kind of like a random question, but some people in chat were talking about Nazis, right? A common topic now. But Nazis, historical Nazis and, neo-Nazis have they have like this conception of the Aryan race, right? But from my view but like obviously the Aryans were a real, ethnic group, right? Or I don't know if that's the right term to use it. But the Nazis' perception of it was not true, right? So who were they really?
Well, there's the term Aryan or Arya is a term that were used by people to refer to themselves. And these people that we're talking about were generally the people that we call Indo-Iranians, who were traveling into India. So, for example, we have references in early Sanskrit literature about people referring themselves as Arya or Aryans, which means nobles. It's a term of superiority and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's one use of the word, and it has nothing to do with.
So it just means noble.
Yeah, it's not talking about Scandinavian people or anything like that. Right? Blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. It's not talking about them. But they've appropriated that term. There's also the technical use of the term, and actually more often than Aryan is the term Indo-Aryan, which is referring to a branch of the Indo-European language family. People who speak Indo-Aryan languages. And we're talking about mainly about Sanskrit and those related languages. So sometimes people will use the word Aryan to refer to the language group, Indo-Aryan. It's better if they say Indo-Aryan, but sometimes they say Aryan for short. Okay. And so that's the other use of the word. But the way that the neo-Nazis and Nazis had used the word, it's completely historically anachronistic. It's not even it's not even the correct, historically speaking, to refer to Europeans as Aryans.
Could you explain actually to my audience like what the term anachronistic means?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, historians use it all the time, but yeah, a lot of people don't actually know the concept.
It's the use of it could be a term or using anything that's outside of its historical context. It's where it doesn't belong. It's basically talking about something doesn't belong there, right? It's an anachronism. I mean, it's in the wrong time or in the wrong place or something like that. So that's all I meant by it.
Oh, so if I use the term, just to explain it to people, if I use the term race, I guess to describe the Romans, and I'd say like the Roman race, I would be practicing. It would be an anachronistic, way to frame that.
Well, actually, you could also call it just completely incorrect, but
yeah.
But if you say like we were talking about before, using the word race in the context of ancient times would be anachronistic because they didn't have a conception of race, right? So that's anachronistic, yeah.
Yeah, or like homosexual, or the entire idea.
yeah, imposing something from not in their time onto their time would be an anachronism. Yeah.
Um, why was mummification like so common in the ancient
This
world?
came out of nowhere.
I know, like I don't, I just saw a mention in chat about mummification, and I was just thinking because like when I think of the ancient world, just like culturally, like one of the things that comes into my mind is just like mummification because it was common also in. I actually don't know the period it was common in Mesoamerica, but I know obviously it was famously done in Egypt. But why was it so common?
Um, I know more about the Egyptian reasons for mummification than I do Mesoamerican, but
Mm-hmm.
so I'll talk about that. So uh, it probably started happening naturally. The Egyptian climate lends itself to natural mummification. They probably saw it happening to some of their dead bodies, in cemeteries and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the dryness of the climate. So there it is possible for dead bodies, even without going through the process, to at least be partly preserved through natural process of mummification. They probably saw this and then tried to start mimicking it because they thought, well, this is worthwhile. And the reason that they had for doing it had to do with their conceptions of the afterlife. And they believed that the spirits of a person, and they believed that there was more than one spirit in a person, but the spirits of a person would be better preserved in the afterlife if their physical remains were better preserved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we preserve our physical remains, our spiritual side will be better preserved, right, and last longer. So, in other words, basically that's what they're trying to do by
Seems logical. Makes
yeah
sense.
performing this ritual. It helps ensure your health and so forth in the other realm, and that's kind of how it developed. Of course, if you were poor, you didn't get as good of mummification as if you were rich. So a lot of times your everlasting salvation had a lot to do with your class in this life.
Well, what were class structures like in ancient times or in the Near East?
Yeah, a lot of them are similar. Different. I mean, it's slightly different in different countries, but you're going to have your elites, your nobles, your aristocrats, whatever you want to call them. They existed in all the ancient cultures. They're the people that have the land, they have the resources, and so forth, and they are the ones that are usually in power. The kings come from that group. Councils come from that group. They're running things. Okay. And then you're going to have the vast majority of people, which is the common people, and that could range everybody from well, actually, I'm not including slaves in this. I'm talking about free people. So anyone
Mm-hmm.
from a peasant farmer all the way up to a craftsperson, you know, and that's the vast majority of 90, probably 8% of the population would be that group. And you could divide that further, but the idea of a middle class, mm, it's hard to. I think it would be anachronistic to use that word again
Yeah.
to talk about a middle class. Um, it's kind of just common people. Although I will say this. No, no, no. I think no. I'm going to stand by what I said. I'm thinking of a work of art from ancient Mesopotamia. There's this thing that was found in one of the royal graves at Ur,
Yeah.
and it has a depiction of three. It has three tiers of people in it depicted in the art, and they are three classes. Okay, and the top class is the nobility, and you see all these people sitting on chairs and relaxing and so forth. They're the nobles, and then you have the common people, the middle bar, which is the vast majority of the population, and they are taking animals to market, and just going about their daily business. That's most of the people, and then below that you have, who I haven't referred to yet, below the common people, and they're not larger a group, they're probably smaller, but they would be I guess you would call them, in medieval terms, to use one of your terms, serfs or something like that. They're like
Mm-hmm.
half enslaved people, partially enslaved people who owe debt usually and are trying to pay it off, and they're doing a lot of the heavy labor, the more disgusting jobs and things like that, and so you have that group. But you even have a group below that, and that would be all-out slaves, which also
Mm-hmm.
exists. Of course, slavery wasn't necessarily for the lifetime in most ancient cultures. It was until you could get out of it,
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that. Like, One of the problems, I guess, like when we study more modern history, is we have a tendency to only view slavery, particularly from an American lens, right? Thinking of the transatlantic slave trade, but I know that the transatlantic slave trade was particularly gruesome compared to other forms of slavery that had been happening historically. Is that true for ancient history? What were like the main differences of between like slavery then and slavery in the transatlantic slave trade?
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of a lot different. Usually the main way to get into slavery in ancient times was well, there's a couple different ways. One is being captured in war. So you're
Mm-hmm.
like a prisoner of war and you might be enslaved because of that. Or you'd fall into debt and you couldn't pay it off and you'd have to go into slavery to the person that you owed the money to, until you paid it off. Or you could be enslaved by being sentenced to slavery as a punishment for a crime, right? So those are common ways of ending up being slave. But prisoners of war are probably the most. Um, but it was possible to get out of it. Wasn't easy, and some people didn't get out of it. But it was theoretically possible to get out of it by paying off your debts or your debt to society or something like that. Um, you could get out. It wasn't based on race, right? It wasn't based on ethnicity either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was based on your economic standing or your, just what evils happen to befall you in life. So it wasn't like you would recognize, like you'd say, like, oh, that person is a slave because from their skin color or something like that. It had nothing to do with that.
The When I first made Calliopean Club, the Discord server we're in, the structure I did, it focused very much on like the Roman Republic. So I had now we've gone medieval, we moved into a different era, but we had like I was like a consul, and then we had patricians and all of that stuff. And at the bottom, initially when I made it, we had slaves, right? And I got so much pushback about it, right? Because it was seen as racist. That I was putting people into the category of slaves. And I was like, but I guess like through a historical lens, yeah, there wasn't race, just did not play in it. It was just, it was definitely classist, but that was a part of the joke. So I ended up having to get rid of the slave category because of that. Um, yeah, so I wonder, like, do you ever encounter situations like that? I mean, running a Discord server is probably not a common thing, but just situations where like you're using a term that it's not from a historical lens isn't offensive, but today would be.
I can't think of anything comparable to that off the top of my head. But I mean, there are times when I'll be talking and I do have to watch my terminology and things like that because knowing certain words are loaded, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just read recently, maybe you know more about this, about how the term Anglo-Saxon is now being questioned whether it should be used in history circles now.
Yeah.
Uh, uh,
It's
so
getting kind of appropriated by some modern racists.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of interesting. So sometimes things like that happen. We're like, well, we're going to call it something different now or something, because
Yeah.
of the loaded language. So that could happen. Yeah.
What in general is like your approach to confronting, I guess, like pseudoscience or conspiracy theories? Like I think you talked a little bit about it earlier with the Atlantis and all that. But what would you recommend others do?
You're talking about like my historian's approach, or you're just talking about anybody?
Both.
Okay. A historian's approach, the way I approach it is different than the way some historians might approach it, because
Mm-hmm.
some of them are of the opinion that don't engage, just ignore it, don't give them the time of day, don't give them a platform. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can say this is the same argument that you often see in political debate circles as well, right? Do you debate with a fascist or whatever, right? It's the
Mm.
same idea, the same principle. Some historians are like, just they're stupid, ignore them and it will go away. You don't want to feed it, you don't want to feed the trolls. But I'm not of that opinion, because actually we've been doing that for years and it's only grown, right? And there's a lot of historical misinformation out there that's getting more embraced and more widespread.
Mm.
And I think we do need to engage with it, you know. But I don't. I'm not the type that wants to make fun of those people. In my opinion, they're just people who like ancient history, and they might have their facts wrong or something like that. So I try to avoid. I'm not always successful in doing this, but I try to avoid making fun of people, right? And just say, well, if I were them, what would I want to need to know in order to understand, like, I'm on the wrong track here, you know? And then I address it like, well, let's see, now what if that were true, you know? And then you reason it out. And that's what I do in my debunking videos. I basically go through it and say, like, you know, is that so? Is that really the case? Well, let's look into it. Let's research this topic and then see. And I try. So my target audience is actually people who are on the fence, you know, like, should I believe in this? And should I not believe in this? And I'm trying to bring them over to the light side, so to speak, you know?
Yeah, like this is in general like a problem that I've had um, as well. Like where I've told my audience regularly, I get criticized often for being too charitable with people who are pushing, you know, wrong ideas and stuff. But it so often just seems like, you know, I mean, I'm sure you know this as a historian of ancient history, that education's a privilege, right? It's a privilege that's often only, you know, given to a few, and being correct or having the correct information is also a privilege, right? So we shouldn't like just look down at people who have incorrect ideas, you know, and just focus on trying to correct them instead of, you know, making fun of them.
Well, we have basically, I'm oversimplifying here, but we have two choices, you know, destroy or convert. And I'm of the convert camp, okay? So, yeah, that's what I try to do. I try to convince people, try to persuade them. Yeah.
Do you ever get kind of like annoyed with, because I mean, one of the way Ancient Aliens got kind of propagated, and a lot of those problematic ideas was through like the History Channel, ironically. So is it frustrating for you to watch like how the History Channels, you know, become very non-historical?
Yeah, I mean, I understand it because it's the ratings, right?
Yeah.
They're doing it because of the ratings, and they're like, well, wait a minute, we got to make them money. So they're doing what, but I hate Ancient Aliens. You know, it's just ridiculous. But I understand, you know, why they do it. It's the same way on YouTube. You know, what the ancient history channels that get all the views are the loony ones, you know, so it's funny. I've seen people who started channels, you know, around the same time as me, and who are doing like not Ancient Aliens, but they're doing a lot of the, you know, ancient lost high technology, all that kind of stuff, and they're just skyrocketing in views. They're getting the audience, you know, they're doing really well.
Why do people have such an appetite for, you know, things that are just not true?
I don't know. I think it's probably appealing. It's just an appealing idea. It's like science fiction could be real or something. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Mysterious. It's cool. Um, you know, even when people have news in archaeology or whatever, just mainstream news, we'll try to word it in such a way as to sound like that. You know, secrets revealed and mysteries and all that. You know, I'm kind of saying lost civilizations and all. They just try to word it that way because they know that's what people click on.
Yeah. No, that's actually really true. I think like I've been kind of shocked that people even started watching my channel, because I thought the same thing, that like it would end up not being, you know, super popular, because I wasn't like just making these grand political statements, and I try to be very responsible with my language. But you know, I do think that there's one of the cool sides of the internet. There is like an audience that wants that kind of stuff. So yeah, I definitely hope people watch, you know, especially with, like if any of my audience members, like they definitely tune into your YouTube videos, because a lot of them are really cool. I especially love the travel ones.
Oh, so. Thanks. I'm planning on making more of them, but you know, it's been, you know, this year.
Yeah.
But I am planning probably trips to Egypt and Turkey soon. So. Oh,
that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to Turkey once and it was extraordinary. So.
Yeah, so much to see.
Yep. I have one last question.
Okay.
There's oh my god, it actually just went out of my mind. Story of my life. But okay, I'll think of one last question. In general, what would you say is, you know, we talked a lot about Rome and Greece and stuff, and I'm sure, and in Egypt, right? And I'm sure that's like really typical, like the classics, I guess. So and the majority of the questions that I got from my audience were focused on that. So, like, what are some, other ancient cultures that, or ancient civilizations that you would encourage people to do more research on, and, to give us a more broad view of the period?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lately I've been very fascinated by ancient India. Um, Really wonderful culture there. The Indus River Valley civilization is really fascinating. A series of sites, and even later on when you get to the Mauryan Empire, places like that. I also love ancient China. Um, the very first emperor, the terracotta warriors, and all of that, and the Han Dynasty. This is all
Yeah.
really interesting stuff. Um,
Chinese history is extraordinary.
yeah, yeah, and I also this doesn't get a lot of attention, so that's why I'm bringing up the ones that don't get a lot of attention. But
Hmm.
civilizations of Meroe and Aksum, which is basically around Ethiopia. Those are fascinating ancient cultures as well. The Americas, of course, the Maya, which I did a whole series on. That's really fascinating stuff. I love everything. It's kind of hard to leave
Yeah.
anything out.
No, I totally identify. Like, yeah, it's so cool that you're so passionate about it. And I'm sure that that really carries over to with your teaching, like with your students, because yeah, that stuff is contagious, like the coronavirus. Um, I remembered my last question. It was
Okay.
about coronavirus. um,
Oh,
so has there ever been a situation like this? Like, I mean, I obviously we could think of like the plague and stuff in medieval period, but where there was kind of like a pandemic at this level,
oh
during
yeah,
ancient times.
definitely. Several, but one of the most famous ones is the one that occurred during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Um, and he uh, during his he was considered one of well, probably the last good emperor. They sometimes Gibbon called him the last good emperor.
Yeah, because he
um
was the philosopher with
yeah,
stoicism
right.
and all that. Yeah.
But there was a plague that hit the empire during his reign, and estimates are that a third of the population died from this pandemic, or
Wow.
whatever you want to call it. um yeah, now we don't even know what it was, but it was considered by Marcus to be some kind of punishment from the gods. He
Yeah,
thought the might
I
have
don't
something.
blame him.
Yeah. So so that's one. That's a very fascinating plague. But as you can imagine, health was not very good in ancient times, and so it was
Yeah.
just a hotbed for this kind of stuff. Yeah.
How do you think, if you were to just guess, right? Because I know historians tend to deal with history and not the future, but how do you think historians are going to remember the coronavirus pandemic? Do you think it'll be considered like a really important moment?
Probably. I mean, maybe similar to the Spanish flu or something like. Although the Spanish flu killed a lot more people. Um,
But I feel like
but
people still don't talk about it as often.
they don't talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the further away in time we get, the less we'll probably talk about it. I think for a while though, will people will be rephrasing things like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that was in
Mhm.
the days before the pandemic. I think people will be talking like that for quite a while. Um, it's kind of an interesting dividing line because like it's a whole year. That kind of
Mhm.
everything stopped. So it's natural for us to categorize things as happening before that year, and then the things that happen after that year.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, honestly, thank you so much for coming here. Like, it was so cool to get to talk to an actual historian, and especially one of your caliber with the research that you've done. So, like, I really, really appreciate you giving my channel that, and also, do you just want to for since we probably have a lot more people watching right now than in the beginning, do you kind of just want to talk about your YouTube channel?
Yeah, if you're interested in ancient history and we're talking about ancient stuff from all around the globe, come on over to the World of Antiquity YouTube channel. We've got all kinds of stuff there for you that I hope you like. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is Dr. David Miano. Um, do I have an underline underscore in there somewhere? I think it's all just one word, Dr. David Miano.
Mm.
Dr. David Miano. And you can find me there.
Yeah, my mods linked the channel and everything.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
but yeah, thank you so much. I learned a lot, so it was cool to hear about a period that I often don't get to learn a lot about. And yeah, I'm now wondering maybe I should have studied that period instead because it sounds way more interesting.
Well, great. Thanks for having me, Eris. It was much appreciated.
Cool, thanks.
See you later, everybody.
See ya.